If I ask you to think of a time in your life when you felt morally corrupted, dirty on the inside, if you're like most people, you probably wouldn't have to think very hard. You can probably think of some event, something you did in the past that just really made you feel dirty. Sin has to be severed at the root. It has to be severed at the root. Most people try to deal with their sin at the level of actions. Like they'll sin there. From now on, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm going to change my behavior. I'm going to try to do this. I'm going to stop doing that. Or maybe they'll even take it a step further than this. I'm going to avoid influences that push me towards that sin. And that's about as far as most people go in dealing with their sin. That'll never work. Fighting your sin problem at the level of your behaviors is like trying to kill an apple tree by picking the apples. It doesn't matter how many you pick. More of them will just keep growing back after it. You can't, if you want to stop the growth of the apples, you have to cut that thing at the root. Or to put it another way, you can't fight a war if you don't know who the enemy is. You got to find the enemy first before you can engage. No matter how many tactics of warfare you master, if you're in the wrong continent, fighting the wrong country, whatever, you're not going to win the war. You got to know who your enemy is. And if you're wondering how important this is, to know who the enemy is when you're fighting your own sin, to know what the source of uncleanness is, if you want to know how important this issue is, just look at Jesus' response here in Mark 7. Look how long it is. It's one of the longest speeches Jesus ever gives in the book of Mark. Verse 15. Nothing outside a man can make him unclean by going into him. Rather, it's what comes out of a man that makes him unclean. Nothing you can eat can make you unclean. In fact, the statement isn't even limited to just food. In the context, he's talking about food, but he just says, nothing outside you can make you unclean. No influence. Now think about that. Because if we get back to our original question, what is the source of evil? Where does it come from? When Jesus says it doesn't come from anything outside of you, that is a revolutionary idea, not just for Jews. That is a revolutionary idea for all people. We all naturally think that we're infected with uncleanness from some outside source, right? That's just the way that we think. Some influence. That's why we think that we can deal with our sin problem by just separating ourselves from certain influences. I'll stop doing that. I'll stop hanging around that. And I'll stop watching that. I'll get away from these influences, and then I'll solve my sin problem. And different people have different ideas about what influences are causing the sin, where the evil comes from. Religious people tend to think in terms of religious defilement coming from religious taboos, breaking those. Secular people, it's cultural taboos. For conservatives, it comes from TV and movies and the internet and video games and all that stuff. For psychologists, it's imposed on you by people who mistreated you, or maybe it was toxic masculinity or bullying or trauma or whatever. The social justice crowd will say that evil comes from oppressive governments and people in power and rich people. And then, of course, the greatest evil of all, evil corporations. Right? Jesus said, no, none of that. None of that is the source of evil. So what is it? Where does the evil come from? Well, it's right here in verses 21 to 23. And this is just devastating. Look at this. Verse 21. For from within, out of men's hearts, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evils come from inside and make a man unclean. It all comes from inside you. Jesus doesn't hold back, does he? I mean, he just tells it like it is. What is the source of evil? Your own heart. Your own heart. All these things that make us filthy in God's sight originate inside us. Good luck. If you're going to try to avoid bad influences that make you evil, good luck, because the worst influence in your life is right inside your chest. And it's incurable. Jeremiah 17:9. The heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Who can understand it? So this is Jesus' answer to the question about the source of uncleanness. And he says it comes from inside. It's revolutionary, and yet it really shouldn't be any big surprise, right? I mean, it's self-evident, isn't it? This is obvious. I don't know of any passage in the whole Bible that's easier to prove than verses 21 to 23 right here. How can you deny it? Even the people who try to deny it, all they do is transfer the problem from their heart to somebody else's heart, but it still comes from a human heart, right? If you say it comes from TV and movies and internet and all this, how did all that evil get into that evil programming? Human beings, right? It wasn't dolphins. It wasn't Martians, right? It's human beings. If it comes from evil corporations, what are evil corporations? What are corporations? They're people. Right? No document, no legal entity ever committed an evil act. Only human beings can commit evil acts. If it was your parents and they inflicted on you, what are they? They're human beings with human hearts, right? At some point, it has to come from the human heart. No matter how hard you try to push it off to another source, the origin of evil always ends up being the human heart. Who can possibly deny? Just look at this list of sins. Adultery, murder, stealing. How can you possibly deny that comes out of the heart? Right? It comes out of the heart. Where else could it possibly come from? Even if somebody pushed you into it, still, why were you pushable? It's like, oh, it's not my fault. She just pushes all my buttons. Why do you have buttons? Did Jesus have buttons? He got all the same bad treatment from people that we get. He never flew off the handle. Why? Because even though Jesus faced all the evil influence of the world that we face, still there was no corresponding evil in his heart that latched on to that stuff. And so he didn't sin, but we do because we have evil in the heart. At the beginning, I asked you to think of a time in your life when you felt really dirty on the inside. Most likely you thought of some act that you committed, some sin, some physical action you did that was really bad. But we find out that's not what made you unclean. The really hard news is you were unclean long before that. The reason you did that act is because of the unclean that was already in you. We tend to think we are what we do, but in reality, we do what we are.